Nick, after that introduction, I guess they all know we've been around a while.
I was going to say, we must be very, very old. So just to make it easy, John and I know each other. Going back to school at Solomon Brothers, our boss, Henry Kaufman, would confuse us. So we were known as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So anyway, our session today is titled The Global Investment Outlook, Dealing with the Uncertainties, a Fireside Chat. I voted for a poolside chat, but Nick Remillard overruled me. All right, so we're going to start off with what I think are the key issues that investors need to know answers to as you make your investment decisions. And the top of my list is we've seen a global slowdown. I would say pretty much from the middle of last year continuing to present. The big question is it about to continue, or is there light at the end of the tunnel? And right now, John, I don't know how you feel, but I'm getting conflicting messages from the stock market and from the bond market. What the stock market are saying is today, we had a further rally on good news from China. We're almost back to the record highs after the steep sell-off in the fourth quarter. So the stock market is telling me it believes the worst is past. The problem is when I turn to the bond market, the bond yields in the US have dropped to their lowest level in 2 years, but it's worse in Europe, where we're back to negative bond yields, as well as Japan. So my question, John, is which signal do we focus on?
Who do you believe?
Who do you believe?
Well, the idea, of course, is that perhaps in a past era, stock investors and bond investors were different people and had different points of view. Not so obvious. You're a CIO. You look across asset classes. Not convincing to say that today. So the intriguing idea, of course, is that we're sustaining growth at a reasonable pace. Obviously, there are different stories in different regions, but with very low inflation. So the intriguing question is, can we sustain growth with a lower level of inflation than we've gotten used to in the past? Because the recent decline in bond yields in the US have certainly been associated with a rise in real yields. So, and without a notable slowdown in important indicators of the US economy. This is the most intriguing question. Have we reached a new kind of economic equilibrium with much lower inflation than we've had in the past?
Okay, so that sounds to me like you're even keel. You know, not unduly optimistic, not unduly pessimistic, but basically the message is get realistic.
Yes, but there are important questions that need to be looked at because there are important uncertainties around the world in a way that I don't think were present in the same way in the past, in the sense that there's a lot more doubt about underlying economic realities and whether the conventional wisdom about how economies work is really still as applicable as it has been in the past. And it's clear, as I think was discussed in the previous panel, governance issues also are in flux in a way that hasn't been the case for some time.
Okay, John, when I look again in the world, and if you say, where do I spend most of my time now trying to figure out which view is correct? It's not the US. I think the US actually has been more or less on an even keel, although it may have softened this past quarter. But the economy to me that we've got to get right is China. And what we saw last year, about the time that tariffs were first being imposed, I was actually in China in May, was suddenly the Chinese economy softened and, you know, in the low sixes, the first time in about 20 years. So when I read again what's the correct assessment of China, I find two views. One view, the optimistic view, says some of the slowdown was because they tightened credit, the central bank in 2015, 2016, into 17. And Now they're relaxing that, and they're also having government stimulus, especially for state-owned enterprises. So China can stabilize, and so far, I would say that's what the Chinese stock market's telling me it believes. But I see the huge explosion in debt of the Chinese economy in the last decade. And my question is this sustainable? And a lot of the new credit isn't going into the private sector, it's going into the government-sponsored enterprises. So a question about the implications for productivity. So what's your take?
Well, I think the answer here is quite straightforward, and the Chinese authorities would agree. Their path has been, their current path is unsustainable. They can't continue to ramp up debt, credit growth, not just to state enterprises, also to local governments. There's been a huge explosion in the issuance of local government bonds that now is on the same scale as their sovereign bond market, the national government's bond market. So they have, at the same time, they have been investing about double the percent of GDP of any other country in the world. And yet their productivity growth has slowed to a pace that is only average. Huge growth in credit, huge amount of investment, only average productivity, not sustainable. They've at least verbalized the recognition that they have to undergo real reform and acknowledge that the strength of growth in that economy has been in the private sector, not in the state-owned enterprise sector. So the recent apparent re-emphasis on state-owned enterprises can be interpreted either moving backwards and making things less sustainable, or as an effort to force reform on state-owned enterprises. Still unknown. The recent National Development Forum in Beijing, once again, the government is trying to assure both domestic and international audiences that they intend to reform and make their economy more efficient. The problem, two problems. Problem one, domestic problem is how do they do that in the context of a slowdown in growth, because all their levers to speed up growth are anti-reform. Go back to the bad old ways. Secondly is the threat on the international side of trade disputes. There's news today that Liu He, the principal trade negotiator on the Chinese side, senior ranking official, is coming to Washington on Wednesday. Hopefully, folks have decided that must mean some progress. But there are other signs in the air. The Chinese investment abroad has fallen substantially, dramatically in the last few years, and foreign domestic investment in China also has fallen substantially. So the external side is a bigger question, I think, than people have understood. It's not just trade.
Okay, so let's though follow up, because again, when I look at what happened to China last year, and you say, when did the slowdown really hit? I would basically say fourth quarter. And if you said worldwide, Europe and other economies, when did it really hit fourth quarter? And that's when the markets tanked. And it was at that time, as you'll recall, that we were still in the situation where the Trump administration was threatening that if China did not reform, they would raise duties from 10% to 25%. We've since backed off. Maybe there's a truce. And so my question, though, is let's say we get a handshake at the end of this month. Clearly the markets will like it. But is that the end of the story, or is this just an ongoing saga?
Let's see. If a trade deal is China will buy more soybeans and Boeings, I would say this is a quick fix that doesn't solve the problem either domestically or externally. Clearly, they need to reform their domestic economy in a relatively thoroughgoing way, and they say they will do it, but there are still doubts, even internally, whether they can. And that's in a context in which we also have to recognize Growth in labor force in China has slowed substantially and will slow for years. So growth in China is going to be slower than in the past, almost certainly over the medium term. But reform is necessary even to achieve that. And if we're not able to arrive at an agreement on what defines a level playing field for trade between a Chinese economy with substantial state involvement and the other advanced economies, much more driven by private sector, if we can't come up with a trade deal that defines a level playing field, then the problems are going to be ongoing. So there's a challenge domestically in China, a challenge externally.
Okay, so let's now come back to the United States. Last year, we had the global economy, there was a bifurcation. Basically, the overseas economies were all slowing. The US economy had its best year of growth, not quite 3%, since the financial crisis. But yet, in the fourth quarter, there was some moderation into the upper 2.5% area. The current quarter, some people don't, or the past quarter, don't think growth will have hit the 2% mark. So there's definitely a slowdown. And the question then is, again, is this temporary or not? So one of my questions is, there's no doubt that the tax cuts helped give a boost to the economy last year. But the debate between Republicans and Democrats is, was it a sugar high?
Was it? Well, look, time will tell, but there are important questions in deciding that. First of all, let's look at the notion of how big a slowdown is underway. And let's try to look at some indicators that are the most timely. And for me, I don't know about you, Nick, I like to look at jobless claims because they are universal, they are not subject to revision, they are very reliable, and they have been astonishingly steady and low. So if you just look at the trend of jobless claims, there is no sign of any big change in the trajectory of the US economy in the near term. Steady, solid, not a sugar high, not a lack of sugar low. But as we all know, the big weakness in the US economy over the past few years has been weak business investment. The heart of the tax reform was corporate tax reform. It did result in a boost in corporate investment and business investment last year. So a key question is, first, will that investment produce A, new output growth, B, productivity growth? Because to get new productivity gains, you have to make investment in new technology. And third, will the corporate tax cut produce longer term gains in more sustainable gains in investment? That'll determine if it's a sugar high or not. I think frankly, the jury is still out. But if I look at those jobless claims, it looks to me like the economy continues on much more of an even keel than the newspaper headlines would lead you to believe.
Okay, so that's basically the tax side of the question. What I want to do is shift to monetary policy, which clearly was a focal point for the markets in the fourth quarter of last year, when the markets were fearful that the Federal Reserve was going to continue tightening even as the rest of the world was weakening. And then, of course, we had the intervention by President Trump on his views on Chairman Powell. And then we had the Fed, in all my years I've covered the Fed, doing a dramatic about-face and now saying no more intention to raise rates, we're on hold as far as the eye can see, although we're going to look at the data. So one of my questions is, how concerned should people be about Fed making a mistake? And two, is this disturbing to see the administration, even continuing more recently, Larry Kudlow, the Fed should lower interest rates 50 basis points now. I never recall that in the years that I've been following the markets. What do you think?
Well, first is easy. Of course, it's easy to forget. It was Bob Rubin who convinced Bill Clinton that nobody talked about the Fed except the Fed. There have been comments previously, but not quite as dramatically as we've seen now. Is that a good idea? Can't be a good idea. You can't have this kibitzing from the sidelines if you're trying to convince everyone that the Fed is strictly looking at the facts and not the politics. So, bad idea. Will the Fed be cowed by that? I can't think so. If I were the chairman of the Fed, I'd keep my head down and do my job and try to filter out as much as I could of this noise. But is it reasonable to be obsessive about the Fed these days? I don't think so. Is the Fed going to be taking preemptive action, either to stimulate the economy or to slow the economy? I can't see it. What we've seen is they've been very reactive to the data, but that means I wouldn't look to them for the leading indicator about where things are going. Policy's going to follow the data, follow the economy, and the Fed will follow along.
All right, let's switch gears now. Go to the other side of the Atlantic. Europe. Europe is concerning. Europe, the big positive surprise in 2017 was that the European economy grew by more than 2%, and we had basically a synchronized global expansion. Right. Then suddenly, last year, Europe out of the blue softens, and toward the end of the year, probably growing less than 1%. The ECB, that had been thinking of beginning to gradually tighten in terms of its balance sheet, says don't worry about us until 2020. So we have that, but now we have Brexit on the doorstep. So actually my question is, the easy one is this the worst divorce we've ever seen? And point two is, there was a small country called Greece, and for 4 or 5 years, all the market focused on was Brexit. Why did that small country have a much bigger impact than the much more important country called Brexit, where so far the market says, who cares?
Yeah, kind of. Well, an excellent question, of course. Why was Greece such a big deal? Greece was a big deal because they were part of the Eurozone, because Europe had not contemplated in its institutional framework what would they do in the case of a potential default by a Eurozone member. They didn't know what to do. And because the major banks in the Euro area had been acquiring debt from these countries. So it had been clear a little country like Greece defaulting could have brought down or created serious dislocations for the whole European banking system, the Eurozone banking system. The UK, first of all, it hasn't actually left the EU yet, and there are many folks who think at the end they're not going to. It's still a controversy, even at the last, I guess we're beyond the last minute. It was supposed to be last Friday. But at the same time, they have a floating exchange rate. Now, it is a little surprising to see the pound holding up as well as it has been, since there's virtually universal consensus that a Brexit, a hard Brexit, which is also a possibility, would be very negative for the UK economy. Net result, there's still the possibility of some substantial reaction for the British economy, for the European economy, and for markets, but not in the same way or for the same reasons as Greece was threatening a Europe that was unprepared.
Okay, just quick follow-up. Bottom line, it's going to be April, is it 12? Is the new day you have to turn in your papers for the extension?
Oh, you mean the EU and
yeah,
yes,
yes,
okay.
Of
course.
And I know we can always kick the can down the road, but let's say, sorry, hard Brexit. What do markets do?
I would suspect they will be muted in their response because it still doesn't define what the relationship would be with the EU and the UK. There are threats of near-term dislocation how are we going to get food in and medicines in if there are now a customs border between the UK and the rest of the EU? I suspect there will be arrangements made, but it still will leave open the question of what will the long-term trading relationship be between the UK and the EU. It's absolutely remarkable and fantastic that this has just dribbled on in this inconclusive way.
So now we haven't covered Latin America, where you started your career. You saw Peru, you saw Chile, you saw the Brazilian debt negotiations. So you saw the bad period, but then you also saw the period of optimism. Where are we today when you look at the region?
Oh, I think it's fingers crossed, right? For a while now, you've had this dichotomy. The West Coast seems to be relatively well managed, and the East Coast has been various varieties of disaster. And now, with the Macri government and the IMF program in Argentina, with the Bolsonaro government in Brazil seemingly on a path towards some potentially important reforms, with Mexico having transitioned to the new government with only modest perturbations so far, I think that there is a real, obviously we're all mesmerized and horrified, I think, by the disaster of Venezuela, almost unimaginable. But if Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, reasonably well managed and undergoing some reforms, this is a real opportunity. I hope it's not missed. Remember back once we talked about free trade agreement of the Americas, I hope that the situation is recreated in the next few years, that we can again start talking about that, something that would be tremendously positive for our whole hemisphere.
So we're getting down near the end of the wire, so we got to be quick. TransPacific Partnership did we blow it?
Well, yes. I hope not forever. But look, we blew two things. One, not just, and it takes two to tango, it takes two not to tango. Remember TTIP? Everybody remember TTIP? You don't? Oh, well, that was the trade negotiations with Europe that have never happened. That could have been immensely powerful in setting global standards for trade, but neither the US nor the Europeans really had their heart in it. And I thought that was a huge missed opportunity. And now, with TPP, the idea was, okay, it was a kind of an odd mix of countries, but the idea was to start to set agreements that would set standards that would preempt other standard setting operations. Because I said back when, this is really the key for future trade. We've got to develop standards of what defines a level playing field between China and elsewhere, but more generally. And we've failed in the Doha Round. We tried to recreate a partial deal through the TPP that would provide a basis, a foundation for additional building of standards, and instead we're nowhere. Trying to do this bilaterally between the US and China, it can't work that way. It's got to be much broader and much more multilateral if it's going to succeed.
All right, we're almost out of time. I'm not going to leave this in one of these things where you say, I heard a lot of stuff, but what do you do? This is not a recommendation. This is just Nick Sargen,
yes.
Personal portfolio. That's what matters, right? What do you do? Are you optimistic, Nick, or are you pessimistic? And my definitive answer is yes. I can't make up my mind, honestly. I find that, I hate to do this. You have the two-handed economist, but there are times where the risks are fairly evenly balanced. I think that's what you've heard out of John. So what does that mean? Here's my story. Fourth quarter, I did warn my boss. I was worried because of the trade issue maybe leading to a serious weakening. And so I said, I think we need to put a hedge on. He did, but not for my reason. We took it off. Right now, Do I add risk to my portfolio? No. Do I sell? No. I am comfortably indecisive. So,
but ready to act, right?
but ready, that's it. And if you say, what's your trigger point that you're looking for? I am, okay, and maybe come to the session on world trade. I have one indicator I didn't show you. It's the volume of world trade growth, exports plus imports, all countries in the world. The recovery from the GFC, huge rebound, and then it was doing pretty well. Last year, it turned negative at the end of the year. If I start to see that going further negative, I get more defensive. If I start to see that improving, I say, okay, we've passed the test.
One final word, an advertisement. Remember back in the global financial crisis, the principal institutional response was the formation of the Group of 20 Leaders process that produced unprecedented amount of international cooperation, action, and turned the global economy around. I had hoped this would usher in a new era of cooperation because there wasn't a sense of conflict. We were all in it together. Since that time, that sense has been virtually completely lost. The G20 process has pretty much lost meaning. What it seems everyone's intent on rebuilding on a regional level in Europe, here in the US, with its principal trading partners, and Asia, which doesn't have any overriding organization right now at all. What I'm trying to say is, eventually, if we're going to make really sustained progress on reestablishing solid growth on a sustained basis, we're going to have to rebuild an effective multilateral approach. And it looks like, sad to say, I thought maybe we had it, and it's been allowed to drift away. Maybe we have to rebuild it on a regional basis or bilateral basis, but we shouldn't miss the big picture. If we can't put together a set of global trading rules or to define a level playing field, we're going to all pay a price.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you all for being here, and please have coffee.